Xi Jinping and Zelensky finally called each other. Let's talk about it. Welcome to China Insider. I'm David Zhang. Today, Zelensky and Xi Jinping had a call, and it's quite important, so let's analyze it. After months of speculation as to when will Xi Jinping call Zelensky to play its so-called peaceful role in the Russian-Ukraine war, it finally happened today. But I question the timing of this call simply because it could have happened a year ago, yet it happened today. The reason is that this call was a damage control call, in my view. It was to put out the fire set by this man, Liu Xiaoye, who is the Chinese ambassador to France. In my last episode, I talked about what he actually did, so check it out. But to summarize, basically, Liu told French media that former Soviet states like Ukraine do not have sovereignty as countries according to international law, and that Crimea also doesn't belong to Ukraine based on the same ideas. That outrageous comment, followed by more outrageous comments, especially the ones that essentially denies the existence of 14 countries in Europe, could have severely damaged the China-Europe relations. So all of China was on damage control this week. However, what Liu said is very much the true thinking of the CCP in order to help Russia, which in turn helps them to create this new authoritarian-based world order. Now, I maintain that Xi Jinping and Putin are allies. They would never end the war for the benefit of Europe and to the benefit of Ukraine, unless there are certain political benefits to Xi Jinping himself. Still, this call is forced upon Xi Jinping because it can at least convince some people in Europe that China is trying to play and mediate the peace between Russia and Ukraine. Now, it might appeal particularly to Macron in France and his company of politicians holding similar positions in China. What we saw that even Macron, of course, was stunned by the comments of Liu Xiaoye, and it wouldn't actually help Xi Jinping with Europe in general if he had left the comments unchecked. So I think that Xi Jinping and Zelensky's call was always a card that the CCP can play in times to rescue China-Europe relations. Unfortunately, it was just forced to be played at this time. According to the Wall Street Journal, it was Macron who proposed that Xi Jinping would call Zelensky. Xi had agreed to do so. After the call, China's readout says the following: mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity is the political foundation of China-Ukraine relations. And China says it will try to follow the 12-point peace proposal, which to this day still actually hasn't been even attempted to be followed by China itself. And in these proposals, Xi Jinping calls for 4 shoulds, which are strict observance of universally recognized international law, including the UN Charter, the sovereignty and independence, and territorial integrity. However, the CCP never actually opposed these shoulds themselves either for, of course, wanting to invade Taiwan, or by simply watching Russia take Ukraine step by step. And it shows us that the CCP has maintained the same lying position it has once held on to basically since the beginning of the war. And other than that, the two sides also promised to not evolve the war into a nuclear one. And perhaps, I guess, the only action that we can see from this meeting or this call is that the Chinese side will send a special representative of the Chinese government on Eurasian affairs to visit Ukraine and other countries to conduct in-depth communication with all parties and, of course, to settle the political crisis in Ukraine. In other words, China will be sending somebody to all of those 14 countries that were offended by the comment on TV from Liu Xiaoye. Whereas the Ukraine side will be sending a special ambassador to China for, I guess, since 2 years ago. And aside from these, the Chinese readout fundamentally ignored 2 very important points, which is basically the summarization of the entire relationship between Russia and Ukraine, and of course now involving China. The first is the Crimea situation, and the second is the invasion. In the Chinese readout, neither of these 2 terms were used or mentioned. That basically tells us a very clear signal that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't see a way to solve the issue of Crimea to the benefit of Ukraine, and by extension, sovereignty of Ukraine. And the second, it doesn't consider the Russian action and invasion of Ukraine, at least not in an official diplomatic situation like this. Of course, China's position has been pretty consistent. If I recall, they've never actually called the invasion, well, an invasion since the war started. And they don't actually want to see Putin fall from power. So the idea that they're just going to help Ukraine reclaim Crimea seems to be far-fetched, considering that they want Putin to win out in the end or drag this out for as long as possible. So was this call a sincere attempt to create peace? Of course not. It just tells us that Xi Jinping was basically forced to call at this time in order to put out the fire that is burning across Europe due to his ambassador's comment. Now, the Ukraine side's readout offers a much stronger tone and a more clear look at the phone conversation. Zelensky said twice in the readout that Ukraine's border and territory must be restored to that of the 1991's internationally recognized border, which includes Crimea. Zelensky also stressed that Crimea is a part of Ukraine. He also told Xi Jinping that both China and Ukraine should follow the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, which, of course, China is also signed on to as well. In the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, the United States, Russia, and Britain committed to respecting the independence and sovereignty of the existing borders of Ukraine, and as well as to refrain from the use of threat or use of force against the country. Now, those assurances were key in persuading the Ukrainian government to give up what was the third largest nuclear arsenal, I think something like 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads. Now, if China agreed to the memorandum, well, it of course denies the claim that by Ambassador Liu Xiaoye, which says that Ukraine is not a sovereign country. But again, before the invasion, China was also a large trading partner with Ukraine, but that hasn't really stopped the CCP from allowing Putin to invade. So a concrete action not mentioned by the CCP is, of course, that Zelensky says all states should refrain from supporting Russia in the war. This should apply to military technical cooperation, including the supply of weapons. We know that in some intels do suggest that China has been supporting lethal aid to Russia. So I think a part of the reason Zelensky wanted the call anyways is to ensure that China doesn't send anything that's going to change what's the state of the war right now, which is essentially in a stalemate. And if so, then that, of course, counters the effort to support Ukraine. In other words, China remains neutral, as they claim, should actually come with actions that would suggest and indicate that China is not supporting Russia with lethal weapons. And if they are as neutral as they say, well, they shouldn't be secretly supporting Russia either. Now, we could argue that maybe Xi Jinping doesn't have 100% control over Putin's decisions, but if that is the case, well, this video may claim otherwise. This is when Xi Jinping was about to leave after meeting with Putin in March this year. Xi told Putin that change unseen in a century is coming. That doesn't sound like someone who wants to stop a war or doesn't have control or influence over Putin. So I really believe that Putin listens to Xi, but Xi Jinping doesn't want the war to end because it's not beneficial for China's influence. So here comes the problem. Zelensky, in his readout, clearly outlined that China needs to tell Russia to retreat from the annexed and currently occupied territories to that of the 1991 agreement. Russia would never do that. China probably couldn't convince Russia to do it. China knows Russia probably won't do it unless there's some really big incentive from China that can offer to Putin. Zelensky knows that Xi Jinping probably can't help make that happen because, like I said, say Crimea goes back to Ukraine, that can only happen if Putin dies or he falls from power. So what was really the point of this call then? I'd say that just a forced attempt by the CCP to rescue its relationship with the European Union, because right now China's EU relationship is largely dependent on how it handles the China and Ukraine relationship. As I said, the card to play is to call Zelensky sometimes because it shows Macron and company that, hey, I'm China, I'm trying to negotiate peace. But it wouldn't convince anybody who already knows that Xi Jinping is really here for peace or actively trying to stop the war. Again, they could have done this last year, but they didn't do it. In this sense, it really didn't go anywhere after the call. No one achieved what they wanted. According to the Ukraine readout, Volodymyr Zelensky also reaffirmed Ukraine's unwavering position on adherence to the One China policy. He, of course, then said he thanked Xi Jinping's support for Ukraine's interdependence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Basically, it's another way of saying, if you want us to follow a One China policy, you better follow the sovereign Ukraine policy as well. Zelensky also says, quote, peace must be just and sustainable based on the principles of the international law and respect for the UN Charter. Now, this is quite important to understand because we know that China never follows international law, yet they always claim that they do things according to the laws and the standards based on the United Nations. So their real-life actions contradict that of their words. And this includes supporting Russia, which has basically shown the opposite of respecting the UN or otherwise. And with those comments from Ambassador Liu Xiaoye, it tells us that the secret thinking in the Chinese Communist Party is to egg on Russia to continue the war so that Russia can create more regions in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, to the point where they can actually exert influence and creating the world order where China and Russia are the key players. The Chinese Communist Party's game plan for Europe is quite simple: to divide and conquer. It is working on Macron and France. It almost stopped working when Liu made those comments, perhaps even some other countries too. But now, in order to rescue that, they have to basically say that, hey, we're going to try to play neutral for however long we can keep this facade for these European nations. So this is to prevent the Eastern Europe and Central Europe especially from forming a collective view on China that is unfavorable, where it can influence the decision of the European Union, because that will alienate China, right? It will make China's effort to charm Europe much harder. And if so, even Macron at that point may not have the influence needed to change the EU's stance on China. So Xi Jinping needs to make sure in this direct fight against the United States, Europe is at least a neutral to leaning on China's position for the benefit. And right now, China is retaliating against the United States as we know it, because the US had arrested spies working in Chinese police stations, or that it's blocking technology against China. So the CCP recently refined espionage laws to target US firms, and they also arrested many people. The most recent one is the US-based Bain & Company, which is a consulting firm, had its headquarters in Shanghai searched by police. They took away computers, but of course they didn't detain anybody. But last month, Chinese authorities actually raided US due diligence firm Minsk Group's Beijing offices, and they detained 5 local staff and closed its China operations. So it's very clear that the relationship between the Chinese and the United States, it's hitting rock bottom in almost every aspect. So right now, they seek to go to Europe to find the alternative ally, someone that can combat the US's influence with China together. And they're just creating a period to create some sort of a strong approach to EU. But I guess Zelensky knows that right now, China won't end the war, but they also want to make Europe seem like they're friends. But to do so, they have to get through Zelensky's Ukraine first. So I think that's where things are at, where Ukraine, China, and Russia are, even though they're talking, they're not really achieving anything. I think in the next step, it's some sort of a physical meeting. But I really don't see how this gets resolved unless Russia somehow retreats. But again, that's never going to happen, because if Putin falls, China is very worried. All right, that's it. Today's analysis on the call between Zelensky and Xi Jinping. If you enjoy the content, please subscribe to our channel and like this video to help us get the video seen by more people on YouTube. And also comment below what your thoughts are on the call. All right, this is China Insider. I'm David Zhang. We'll see you next time.